When my sister, Wanda Gåg, left Minnesota for New York City, where she would become a famous artist and children's book author and illustrator, I was 10 years old. My brothers and sisters and I missed her terribly, but over the years and after many adventures, all but one of us joined her on the East Coast. Throughout my own career as an artist and illustrator, many of you have written letters asking questions about Wanda. I've written a story so that when you enjoy her books and fine art, you'll feel almost as though you knew her and her brood of youngsters, as she called us younger siblings. I was the youngest on the family ladder, you see. Wanda was the oldest, the firstborn, at the top of the ladder. I was born when she was 15, and because of tragedies in our family, she had become and would remain like a mother to me. In between us, there were 4 other sisters and a brother. My father, Anton Gåg, was a German Bohemian immigrant who came to the Midwest in 1873, first to St. Paul, Minnesota, and then to the small town of New Ulm. He was full of dreams and ambitions to be a painter, and in time he would do just that. The years went by. One day, Anton advertised for a young lady assistant with artistic ability for his elite art studio. The young woman who applied for the job was Elizabeth Biebel. Anton saw her, liked her, hired her, and married his young assistant, Lissy Biebel, in 1892. This was my mother. She was 24, and her new husband was 9 years older. And on a cold day in March 1893, Wanda Hazel was born. Her hair was truly as black as ink and very glossy, and she looked at the world out of great, dark, wondering eyes, as in this portrait her papa painted of her. In due time, Wanda had a baby sister, a blue-eyed little cherub, whom they named Stella Lona. Papa helped an architect design a house on the corner of Washington and 3rd North Streets. And now here was this new family in the neighborhood, with the father a painter and kind of a strange fellow, thought some of the more practical people in town. Think of all the heat you lose in winter through all them panes of glass. And no vegetable garden, just grass for a big play yard? If the house and yard on North Washington Street had seemed just a bit large when the Gågs first moved in, let me tell you it didn't stay that way long. The babies kept coming. Until by the end of 1900 there were 5, all girls. Then a baby boy was born, Howard. Papa had a bad toothache that evening, but when he was told that he had a son, our toothache-y papa was all smiles, as Wanda said. For the most part, they were good children, although certainly not a flock of angels. As our father said, I may not have much money, but I am rich in children. Wanda Hazel, a thoughtful, serious big sister. Stella Lona, lively and impish. Tusnelda Blondine, neat and orderly. Asta Theopolis, comical and sweet-natured. Daily Marilyn, so gentle and soft-hearted that she cried when anyone else got hurt. And finally, the only boy, Howard Anthony Jerome, a serious little fellow with a sweet disposition. In winter, the little Gågs bundled up to keep from getting frostbitten and went on a sleigh ride, sometimes hopping on the runners, keeping mum as mice, for just let the driver up front see you and he'd make you hop off again. And at Christmas, Such a flurry and a scurrying as they made doll clothes and cardboard doll furniture and drew calendars and bookmarks for one another, whispering and chattering, sometimes in German, sometimes in English. "Tussie, don't look," or "Stella, close your eyes." They wrote letters to Santa Claus, too, promising to be good if St. Nick would only bring a 5-cent writing tablet or a new pencil or some ribbon for a doll. In the spring, they skipped up the steep bluffs to Herman Heights Park. At the top was the monument, seen from any part of town, of the mighty Herman Arminius, the war hero of ancient Germany. They picked wildflowers and put them into May baskets they had made. Then in summer were visits to the Beebles' farm, where they fed Grandma's chickens, switched flies off the cows while Uncle Frank was milking, and ate Aunt Mary's cheesecake dotted with prunes. In fall there was school. From the 6th grade on, Wanda caught the writing bug and also had drawing fits, as she called them, when she simply had to draw on any little scrap of paper. Our papa was decorating a church in Mankato when I came into the world, May 24th, 1907. Wanda named me Flavia, after the hero of The Prisoner of Zenda. Mama chose Salome, and then Wanda added Betty. It wasn't a happy time because Papa had gotten so sick he had to stop working and come home. The doctor said he had tuberculosis, a sickness in the lungs, and had to take to his bed. Then in the spring of 1908, when Wanda was 15, Papa died on a bed that had been set up for him in the parlor. He had called Wanda to his bedside, took her slender hand in his, and said faintly, "What Papa couldn't do, Wanda will have to finish." Those were his last words. He was just turned 49 years old. On the gloomy, rainy day he was buried, it was my first birthday, and I took my first step. To the saddened family, it was like a ray of sunshine through the dark clouds. It was a sad household now. No more Papa at his easel, or playing the piano or zither and singing in his fine tenor voice. And how was the family going to manage? We would have to stretch out $1,200 in insurance money over quite a few years, along with $8 a month from the county, $1 for each of us, until the older girls were able to go to work. Did it mean Wanda would have to stop school and give up her artwork and perhaps clerk in a store or work as a hired girl, as many people expected her to do? "I just couldn't," she said to Mama, who understood perfectly. "I'm going through high school. So are all of us." It was a happy day when Wanda heard about the Journal Junior, a children's section of the Minneapolis newspaper that paid cash for stories and drawings she sent them. It took a while, but in this way, that first year after Papa died, Wanda became the breadwinner of the family. The grandma folks and many kind townspeople helped out, but it was a slip of a girl that really pulled the family through. In an old accounting ledger of Papa's, Wanda began keeping a diary on what we children had for dinner or what we were doing or saying. We still spoke German at home, and she recorded that half of my first words were in that language. One of my earliest memories was using Papa's old pipes to blow soap bubbles. Today, whenever I think of soap bubbles, I think of tobacco smell. All through high school, Wanda drew and dreamed. She was going through a very giddy stage and had to admit she was too silly to be awake some days. Now and then, during these criss-cross years, when things went crooked at home and she felt weepy, she'd play on Papa's out-of-tune piano, drowning out the squeaks by playing good and loud. She and Stella now had the cozy attic room that used to be Papa's studio, an ideal place to get away from the hubbub of a house full of younger children. Wanda tacked up many of her drawings on the walls so she could study and criticize them. In April 1910, Robert Kohler of the Minneapolis School of Art came to the house to pick out some of Papa's paintings for an art exhibition, and also chose some of Wanda's sketches, one of Asta, one of Tussie, and one of Daly. On the evening of the exhibit, when the list of prizes was read, she couldn't believe her ears, because an extra prize was given to a young girl of New Ulm, and President Cyrus Northrop of the University of Minnesota presented her with $5 silver. Kohler and Northrop encouraged her to go to art school. She wondered, would she ever get there? At school was a new girl, Alma Schmidt, who became Wanda's lifelong friend. They practiced duets on the piano, got up at 5 o'clock in summer to take a picnic breakfast up to Herman Heights, or went swimming by the old mill on the Cottonwood River. I began to draw myself at an early age, like this little sketch on a scrap of cardboard, and I tagged along after my big sister the way she had followed Papa around. So Alma called us Mutt and Jeff, after the funny paper characters in the newspaper. My other nickname was Flops, ever since one of my little playmates, Stubby Miller, called me that because he couldn't pronounce my name. In winter 1912, the house was often cold, and although we slept under feather beds, we had to wear our long underwear besides to keep warm. Our mittens and stockings wore out, which was very embarrassing, and there were earaches and toothaches that Mama healed with love and the help of home remedies, and so we got along. In the spring, Wanda graduated high school, as she had vowed to do, while we younger children ran barefoot on the grandma folks' farm for long, happy weeks in the summer. Wanda studied for the exam to teach country school in the fall. Once she got the hang of teaching, she really liked it, and there was money to send home to Mama. But her 7 dearest possessions had to be put aside, because she worked hard to teach all 8 grades in one room. What she didn't know was that way off in the distance, knights in shining armor were coming to brighten her future. Along came Charles Weschke, who had greatly admired Papa and now wanted to help the artist's talented oldest daughter go to the St. Paul School of Art. Arrangements were made with the business manager of the school, Tyler McWhorter, or Uncle Mac as she began to call him. But she worried. Did she have the right to go and pursue her dream? Draw on, draw ever? Always Wanda remembered Papa's last words, and she just knew she had to carry on. Stella once said to a friend that all of us knew this was true, and not one of us ever envied Wanda in any way, but were always happy when she could study art. That summer, I was 6 years old. Wanda's mentors, Professor Kohler, Mr. Weschke, and Uncle Mac, took a look at her sketches of me and all encouraged her to go to art school. Having an education meant she could earn a better living for our family in the long run and make sure all of us went through high school. And so she went to art school in St. Paul in 1913. She put her heart and soul into her drawing, even sketching late at night in her room at the YWCA. After classes, she made posters and portraits at $1 apiece, money she sent to Mama. When she came home the next summer, she brought little presents for us all, and for me there were some short socks. I'd never seen socks before. only the long white stockings we wore in summer. This was something new, the latest rage in the Twin Cities, and I was the first one to wear them in New Ulm. Wanda made sketches galore, discovering that plain brown wrapping paper, free from the grocery store, worked marvelously well for making pastel drawings, like this one of me. And just when she needed it most, another knight in a business suit came to the rescue, so she could continue with art school. This time it would be the Minneapolis School of Art, paid for by Mr. Herschel V. Jones of the Minneapolis Journal. Breadwinners in the family were now Tussie and Stella, who were teaching country school for $50 and $55 a month. Evenings, we sat around the big kitchen table, drawing on any little scraps of paper we could lay our hands on, such as my sketch here of Daly. It was in the snowy month of January 1917 that our mother, 48 years old, was taken from us. She had a sort of galloping consumption, we were told, and was sick only a few weeks. A blizzard got so bad that no one could get through the storm. There we were, left alone, 7 orphans. We had a guardian appointed by the court. Family friends were kind to us, and for a while we had a housekeeper sent by a group of well-meaning townspeople. A church group offered to adopt some of us, but no, Wanda, as oldest in the family, decided we must not be split up. We were dazed, but managed to work out a plan. The next year was the one I described in my semi-autobiographical novel, A Wish for Mimi, with myself pictured as Mimi on the cover. Our plan for the rest of the school year in 1917 was that Asta, age 17, Daly, just turned 16, Howard, just turned 14, and I, 9 years old, would stay home and keep house as best we could alone, while Tussie, 19, and Stella, 22, were earning money for us teaching in the country and coming home on weekends. And Wanda, 6 weeks shy of her 24th birthday, finished art school, sending us every penny she could make on the side. Not that things were easy for us 4 younger ones alone at home, especially with the weather against us. The winter was bitter cold. Water pipes froze and burst in the cellar, so we had no water and also couldn't use the furnace. We closed off the upstairs and kitchen and lived in the dining room and parlor with a small wood-burning stove for heat. There was a cot nearby for Howard to sleep on, while Asta, Daly, and I shared a bed, myself in the middle, snug, safe, and warm. We took turns lugging water by the pailful from the Bauman's outdoor pump across the street. Although times were hard, with Mama in heaven watching, as Asta reminded Howard and me when we were naughty, we were content. We chopped wood for the woodbox till we had calluses. We used a shoebox to put mail in for one another, with letters and stories eagerly passed out each day. Daly put out a weekly funny paper, no bigger than a postcard, with tiny drawings of people only an inch high. Asta and Daly were wild about learning to bake, but butter, milk, and eggs were as scarce as hen's teeth. We practically lived on cornmeal mush with a few raisins in it, my older sisters going without in order to fill Howard's and my stomachs. Came spring, things looked brighter, with that terrible winter behind us. Plus, Wanda illustrated her first book, a child's book of folklore, with many sketches she had made of me with my cousin, Dolores Beeble. I had just turned 10 years old when Wanda finished art school that summer. She brought home the good news that she and her beau, Adolph Dane, were 2 out of 12 students in the entire United States to win scholarships to the Art Students League in New York. It would take courage to go so far away and courage to be herself as she was meant to be. But happy? Talk of it, to borrow one of her expressions. She determined that the best thing for us to do was to sell the house and move to Minneapolis, because my older sisters could get better jobs there. But the house did not sell, so for another year, 4 of us stayed home, while the 3 oldest sisters continued sending money. Meanwhile, Wanda went with Adolph to the bustling city of skyscrapers, New York. Wanda had only $90 to her name. Mr. Jones in Minneapolis paid for her room and board again, this time at the Studio Club on East 78th Street. She worked like a beaver to earn money after class, trying her luck at illustrating magazine covers, then printmaking, and finally doing her first lithograph. The next summer she came home and the house was finally sold. We had scrimped and scratched along, and for the first time in all our years of struggling, the older sisters admitted that things were very hard on us, and they felt like just lying down to die. But selling the house for $3,500 changed everything. The oldest Gågs went to the Twin Cities to find work and an apartment. But Adolph had another idea for the 3 youngest. Oh, but he was nice, that Adolph. He took all kinds of pains to help us out. He and his father came to pick up the 3 of us in their brand new black and shiny Ford and took us for a glorious adventure on their family's farm in Waterville. And Asta, Howard, and I camped out that summer in a tent in a pasture right on a lake. A cow tried to share it with us once, but we shooed her out. In the fall, we 6 younger Gågs were nicely settled in South Minneapolis in a small flat at 3420 First Avenue. It only had 4 tiny rooms, but we were very happy there from 1918 to 1923. We had a gas stove, an icebox, hot running water, and a bathroom, things we never had in New Ulm. Think of it. The money we got from selling the house, we laid out very carefully to pay the rent, light, and gas for many years. I think we must have stretched each dollar at least a mile. None of us ever regretted the Minneapolis step, as life indeed became easier, and we hadn't cared how poor we were, just so no one else knew we were poor. And Wanda could now heave a sigh of relief. Her youngsters were all together again under the same roof. Stella must have been the one to take this picture. She and Tussie, on the left, had jobs to pay the food bills, and pulled the family through. Next is Asta. She stayed home to keep house. Daly, in the middle, was still in high school and made place cards to sell. I was in the 6th grade at Clinton Public School, and on the right, Howard was in public high school and had a paper route, even after his bicycle was stolen. Finally, we were able to take better care of ourselves. Wanda had returned to New York, not to go to school, but to begin what she called her sink or swim period, making a living as a freelance fashion illustrator for magazines. By 1923, Tussie, now called Nelda, had joined Wanda out east. We had moved to an apartment at 3641 Columbus Avenue South in Minneapolis. After high school graduations, Daly went to work as a stenographer, and Howard became a clerk as well as a musician, playing banjo in a band for small-town dances. Asta and Stella both got married. Here Asta is with her husband, Herbert Treat, nicknamed Hub. They headed for New York the next year, where Asta painted lampshades in a studio, and Hub worked as a design engineer for Sinclair Oil Company. Stella married Billy Harm, a professional house painter, and they stayed in the Twin Cities for the next 30 years. For $18 a month, Wanda rented a small house she called Tumble Timbers in the country on Route 1, Glen Gardner, New Jersey, with no electricity, heat, or running water. And Wanda had one of the worst drawing fits of her entire life, sketching everything she saw the way it felt to her. Happy as this made her, she was often homesick and longed for letters from home. I sent her a storybook I made using the backs of Central High School newsletters, the pages all sewn together with white thread. When she opened it, she said tears rushed to her eyes. Someday, she promised, we'll all be together again. In 1925, only Daly, now called Dale, and I, with Howard sometimes, were living in a duplex at 3501 Fifth Avenue South on the left, and then in a small house at 3016 41st Avenue South. I graduated from Central in January. I knew that someday I would become an artist like my sister Wanda, who was free, now that the last of her youngsters had finished school, to do whatever art her heart dictated. One fine spring day in 1926, Dale and I arrived at Penn Station in New York. Two tall, gawky girls with our short hair in a bob, carrying imitation leather suitcases with straps around them to keep them from bursting open. Wanda had been writing to us, "Come to New York," and here we were at last. We went by taxi up to Wanda's apartment at 527 East 78th Street, our mouths open as we gaped at the tall buildings, for we were as green as the tall corn out in Minnesota. Wanda and Nelda were there to greet us, and what a happy reunion we had, sisters together again, all of us through school and all of us with jobs. Wanda's apartment would now be much too crowded, so she had taken another place at 1061 Madison Avenue near 81st Street, and we younger girls were to stay on at 78th Street, with rent of only $28 a month. By fall, Howard had come to New York as well. Wanda rented Tumble Timbers for 3 more summers. She invited Dale and me to spend our vacations there, doing the cooking and housework for our room and board. Dale and I changed off sleeping on a cot and straw mattress upstairs, while Wanda slept in an old iron bedstead she had picked up at a farm sale for $1.75. She even made a linoleum cut of it, and it was one of the first things she ever sold. We used packing crates for cupboards, cooked on a kerosene stove, carried water from the spring, and bathed in the brook. We raised vegetables and ate berries that grew everywhere. Happy? Talk of it. Sometimes Nelda and Asta joined us, and even Howard, who was playing in orchestras or in vaudeville acts, first the banjo, later the guitar. Her lithograph of the house itself was also one of the first linoleum prints she sold. I began typing a ridiculous little magazine I created called Fried Ice, of which I was editor, illustrator, and sole literary contributor, and made elaborate covers in color. It occurred to Wanda that tucked away in her head were stories about two kindly peasants, like those in fairy tales from Bohemia, who couldn't be happy because they were so very lonely. "If we only had a cat," sighed the very old woman. Wanda put her heart and soul into making millions of cats into a book, including much of what she remembered about the grandma folks back in New Ulm. And here is where Earl Humphreys, Wanda's future husband, plays an important part in the story. Earl was now living that summer at Tumble Timbers, often running back and forth the 2 miles to Glen Gardner to bring a knapsack full of supplies on his back. And it was Earl who brought Wanda 2 kittens, Snoopy, the inquisitive black and white one, and Snooky, the cuddly gray one, to be her models for millions of cats. For the backgrounds in the book, she showed the rambly up and down hills around Tumble Timbers, and Howard did the round, fat lettering that goes so well with her drawings. The next summer, I had turned 22, but I was still called by my nickname, Flops, the baby sister. I did housework and cooking at Tumble Timbers in return for my room and board, and Wanda also began to pay me to type out her diaries, which would be published one day. Back in New York, Nelda married Richard Stewart, a radio technician at CBS. I returned to the city and lived in the 78th Street apartment with Howard, with whom I played the ukulele as well as banjo and guitar, and I began to write songs. In September 1929, I went to Minneapolis to help Stella, here in an undated photo, who then was expecting a baby. When Gary was born in November, it was certainly something new to me, getting used to having a baby in the house, since I had always been the baby in our family. At Christmas, we were all so poor that we decided not to exchange gifts in the family. I made cards that I used in place of presents. After the first of the year, I went to stay with Aunt Lena at the farm. Doctors in Minneapolis told me I had nervous exhaustion, low blood pressure, low hemoglobin, and needed to rest and fatten up, since I weighed only 98 pounds. Wanda was making plans to go to the country again, and she thought it would be good for my health if I went as well. So in the spring, Wanda, Dale, Howard, and I went to Wanda's new country retreat in West Cornwall, Connecticut, where sunny weather, picnics, and nature walks restored my health. This retreat was the home of Wanda's friend Louis Gannett, in the back on the left with Howard. A frequent visitor was Robert Jansen, on the left next to Dale, with me and then Wanda on the right. Bob worked for a paper company in New York, and by the next Christmas, he and Dale were married. Louis and his children, in front, were there for 2 weeks, and sometimes we spoke in German so the children wouldn't understand us. To pay for my room and board, I kept house again and typed for Wanda at 50 cents an hour. Wanda said that perhaps I had better do some good, solid, buckling down writing as well as illustrating children's stories myself. She thought I had a good chance of making a living that way. I had no formal training in art, only guidance from Wanda, such as problems she gave me to work out. She would choose photos of clothes from a Sears Roebuck catalog, and then I would draw pictures of people, like this, wearing those clothes, being very careful about how many buttons there were, the sort of collar, the weave of the material. It was first-class practice. Years ago, she had started a book of illustrated lessons in children's sewing called Sew, Sew, and Sew, but had no time to finish it. So that summer, she turned it over to Dale in the middle, who made the illustrations, Asta on the right, who figured out the lessons, and me on the left, who wrote the text. In the fall, we moved back to New York as usual. It was during widespread unemployment of the Great Depression, and I lived on about 50 cents a day, working temporary jobs. Once, a bank failure meant I didn't even get paid. Howard got a job playing in a band and gave me $1, as I had run out entirely. No money to buy a typewriter ribbon to do Wanda's latest manuscript, much less fruit and lettuce. Then Dale moved in, and there was not enough bedding to go around, so we slept cold. Dale had always been fonder of me than of anyone else in the family, and when she suffered from depression, she relied on me a great deal. But my own health had begun to fail again as well, so there we were, sick and miserable, and poor, of course. It was time to flee to the country again. Wanda found yet another summer retreat. This one would be the last, and thus began our final chapter together. 4 miles out of Milford, New Jersey, not far from Tumble Timbers, Wanda and Earl bought a tall, white, L-shaped house with a wide veranda. It had stood empty for years, but gradually we made it into a comfortable home. Wanda called it All Creation because whoever came there seemed to want to draw, to write poetry, to paint, even to sew, but to do something. Early in the cold and bare spring, the garden was the first thing to be tended. Wanda loved gardening, and Earl was consulted so that the composition would be pleasing. All vegetables were laid out so that foliage and colors made interesting patterns for Wanda to draw her garden pictures. Below the hill, on the other side of a stone wall, was a large, sparkling, clear pool where a little stream was dammed up in a natural hollow. In winter, Earl would say, "Time to close up and go to town," which we did. Winter in New York was a time for parties, dancing, and meeting with other artists and writers. 4 of us, Wanda, Earl, Howard, and me, all of us on the right, lived at All Creation off and on for the next 15 years. It was the most secure home we had ever had. Dale, on the left, next to Stella, also came to visit with husband Bob, who took this picture. Then Earl took this one, so Bob himself, in the back, could join our group. By 1932, Howard and I had given up the New York apartment because Wanda still needed me to do housework and cooking and Howard to be the carpenter and handyman. He converted an old wagon shed into a guest house and a studio for Wanda way up on a hill so that no one could disturb her. She liked to sit on the top of it and draw, while I often slept inside at night because Earl was such a boisterous, noisy night owl who liked to nap after dinner, then stay up late and keep everybody else awake. Regular boarders at All Creation were the Cat brothers who had been models for millions of cats. Snooky was lost in the woods for 2 whole years, but one day just suddenly came back, blind in one eye. Asta and Hub visited sometimes. After our book, Sue So-and-so, was published in 1931, Asta illustrated another children's book entitled Little Brothers 3. Hub and Nelda's husband, Dick, were musicians like Howard, and the 3 of them played for our family gatherings at Christmas. There were other visitors, too. Among them, 2 little girls, Janie on the left and Pat on the right, who were the daughters of Wanda's school chum, Alma Schmidt. That's our nephew Gary from Minnesota in the middle. And our niece, Barbara Jean, who was Asta's daughter. Wanda pitched in with the chores at these times, but no matter who was there, rain or shine, she spent part of her time working in her neat, cozy studio. In a 10-year period, Millions of Cats was set in Braille. Her diaries were published with the title Growing Pains, and she came out with 6 more children's books, which were translated into many languages. For ABC Bunny, Howard did the lettering, and Coward McCann paid me $50 to compose the bunny's song. Oh, heaven above! I had written a lot of songs, but for this I was frantic and in a sweat. I was also so broke, I was writing with shoe blacking instead of ink. For Gone is Gone, Wanda thought of the section of New Ulm down by the river that was called Goosetown, where the peasant folk lived. Fritzl and Lisi in the story look pretty much like the good, simple bohemians down there in Goosetown. One day she was sitting at her drawing table by the window in her upstairs room, making a drawing of the witch's gingerbread house in Hansel and Gretel for the children's book section of the New York Herald Tribune. She found herself eager to read all the Grimm's fairy tales in the original German as she had done as a child, and she began translating them into English and making just the right kind of drawings for them. Her last books came into being this way. For her fine art, she worked in pen and ink, brush and ink, and crayon on stone, for that's how a lithograph is made. She worked in oil, watercolor, and even tempera on sandpaper, which was her own invention. She was spoken of as the leading young modern artist in the United States. She was the genius of the family. One was enough in one family, I should say. My own major delights during this time were going barefooted in the garden at All Creation and studying plants, animals, and insects. I loved being outside in what I called my outdoor health office. In 1936, my children's songbook was published, and I began to get work also as an illustrator for children's magazines. That spring, Nelda almost died with blood poisoning, but Wanda's doctor friends cured her with sulfa, which was a new experimental drug. For the summers, it was back to All Creation. Through the 1940s, I kept house, cooked, and began to illustrate children's novels on the side. We spent the war years glued to the radio like everyone else, and did whatever we could for the war effort, with its shortages and ration cards. Wanda and I were staunch pacifists, and we were bewildered how the people in Germany could have let themselves get into such a mess. Howard, who was deferred from serving in the armed forces, contributed instead by working as an engineer draftsman with Hub at Sinclair Oil Company. Our only brother was a man of few words, but one who grinned and enjoyed himself while we did all the talking, or played the guitar while we sang the bohemian songs of our childhood. My 1943 book was a different sort of project for me, a biography of Clement Clark Moore, author of The Night Before Christmas. Illustrating another book brought me special pleasure, as it was by Wanda's old school chum, Alma Schmidt, and was about our life at All Creation. Here on the cover are, from left to right, Woodchucks, Charles and Pudgy, Asta's daughter, Barbara Jean, Wanda, me, Alma Schmidt's daughter, Janie, Howard, Earl, and Alma's daughter, Pat. In 1943, Wanda married Earl, the salesman and labor organizer whom she called her drifter. Just 18 months later, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. Earl took her to Florida for 4 months to escape the winter in New York. They returned in May, and on June 27, 1946, Wanda died in a hospital in New York. This is as much as I can tell you of my sister Wanda, because, like Mama and Papa, she lived only half a lifetime. Always young, cheerful, full of vigor, eager and childlike. full of wonder. She never had a chance to grow old. Did she have any children? People often ask me. No, but she had already raised her brood of youngsters, and with joy and gladness, she had given them her all. She had been working on illustrations for More Tales from Grimm when she died, and I finished the book as best I could so it could be published in 1947 as she would have wanted. All creation was sold that same year, and Earl went through her big trunk, covered by cloth that held her most precious belongings, such as photographs, early drawings, and much of her artwork. In 1950, he died in New Jersey. The same year, Howard got married to Ida Rubin. In the 1950s, I lived in Brooklyn. I finally met the man who seemed right for me, a musician and social worker, and we were planning to get married. But he was diagnosed with leukemia and died within a year. I threw myself into my work as a writer as well as illustrator of my own books for children, publishing 8 titles in 10 years, 3 in 1957 alone. In 1958, the book about my family, A Wish for Mimi, was published, which gave me almost as much joy as did moving into my very first home of my own, a tiny pink and white house with a studio to match. It was built next to Stella and Billy's house in Lake Como, Florida, where they had moved 4 years earlier. Their son Gary came to visit often, even on leave from the Army. But our happy days darkened when we lost Dale, who died in May 1958. Then Howard died in November 1961, followed soon after by Stella in March 1962. Both of my last 2 books, in 1964 and 1969, had settings in Florida. Just as Wanda had foreseen, I had been able to make a living for myself writing and illustrating children's books. And in 1965, I visited New Ulm, collecting facts for this story about my family that I had begun to write. Like my sister and father before me, I could also now study painting, and like them, I did landscapes and flowers. But for me, it would be in watercolor, and especially the scenery, flora, and fauna of Florida. I was in love with the vivid, sunshiny colors of my adopted state, and my tropical palette was quite different from Wanda's or Papa's. It even carried over into my winter scenes, which were splashy and fun with color. I would get my fill of winter when I visited my family, staying with Howard's wife Ida in New York City, with Nelda in Congers, or with Asta in Teaneck, New Jersey. Then I would rush back to sunny Florida and my little house where there was always a kitten or 2. In 1977, I visited New Ulm again and studied works on display by my father at the Brown County Historical Society. In Minneapolis, I was pleased to receive the Curlin Award given posthumously to Wanda by the Children's Literature Research Collections at the University of Minnesota. And what, you ask, was the happiest time? It would have to be when the whole family got together at all creation, that magical time, poor though we might have been. Years later in Florida, I could still call up my memories of the willow tree beside the brook and paint a picture of it, much as I had drawn it in 1946 for the wily woodchucks. And from my diaries at that time, when I was very young, I ran across this passage that still rings true about our tender-hearted family. I love my sisters and my brother oh so much, and when we are all together, people tell me we act like friends, good friends, intimate friends, ideal friends. This, in a vague sort of way, made us seem different from other families. I'm so glad I'm a Gog. I don't see how I could stand being anything but a Gog.